Here's something that I think we all fear and even ask ourselves at points in our lives, which is this it? Is this all there is? And is it all over? Did I get here late? And there's a photo that appeared suddenly on the 12th of May 2019 that perfectly encapsulates this fear. It's this. It's an empty room. Now, nothing is obviously wrong in this photo, but everything about it is wrong. I mean, I'm sure you've been in a room like this, but maybe you've also dreamt it? Like that nightmare of being locked in a giant empty store at night with no way out. And you start thinking, is there something else in there with me? And after this photo was first posted, first in that pre-innocent pandemic May of 2019, but also in the years that followed, millions of people had the same strange reaction to it. It wasn't just a standard creepypasta or a lurid tale. It couldn't be, really, because it seems like nothing has actually happened in that room or will ever happen, really. And yet it seems to evoke this almost primal shudder. And that photo transformed into a bunch of stories. It transformed into outsider art and into videos that gave a kind of weird unlife to that space. It sparked fictional conspiracies and a YouTuber called Kane Parsons to make a video about it. And then a dozen Hollywood executives to message him and chase him up and call him, asking him to make this eerie place real, to put it on screen in the breakout film Backrooms, which I've just watched and I have many thoughts about, which millions of you have already watched and probably have many thoughts about too. So let's do this, right? Let's bring in some of the big guns, some philosophers like Mark Fisher, like Soren Kierkegaard, like Martin Heidegger, Jacques Derrida, all of them, to try and make sense of this unreal, haunting space and this great film. Because what this photo and this film express to me aren't nostalgia, like some critics have claimed, because who wants to go back to those cheap carpets and suffocating offices, with the fluorescent deserts and the homes drained of life? No, I think this photo triggers something much darker. The feeling that after so many economic crashes and pandemics and political breakdowns and crises of one sort or another, we might just be living in the ruins of the present. So maybe we don't want to go back to these rooms, or maybe we're afraid we never left them. So we're living in the ruins of the present. That's a big claim, but what does that mean? Well, there's only one philosopher I personally trust to nail this idea, and it's Tony Soprano.
It's good to be in something from the ground floor. I came too late for that. I know. But lately, I'm getting the feeling that I came in at the end. The best is over.
Many Americans, I think, feel that way.
Today, what do we got?
Did you have these feelings of loss more acutely in the hours before you collapsed?
I don't know.
Yep, it's all over. Even the big guy from Jersey himself felt that way in 1999, which is barely years after the events of the Backrooms and its wider lore are meant to have taken place. Tony Soprano is in that very first episode of the greatest TV series ever made, fight me about it in the comments, telling Dr. Melfi that he's arrived after the party is over. And I can't help but notice what he's looking back at there, the exact world that the Backrooms remembers. Yes, the film is set in 1991, and sorry, but very much spoilers on from this point. It is a great film. I do recommend it. Check it out if you're interested or are a horror fan. But what I think this means, the whole Tony Soprano, it's over of it all, is that the era that is gone was already mourning itself. The whole mythology is built on mourning itself while it was still going on. And that should give us a bit of a pause, because it's an obvious objection to everything I'm about to argue. It's the counter-argument that every generation believes negatively that it came in the end, and that the party's over, that they'll never have it as good. The silent generation probably believed it. A lot of the boomers definitely believed it. Tony's one of them. Gen X built basically a whole aesthetic out of believing this. Gen Y, Gen Z, we're saying it today. So maybe the Backrooms is just the latest manifestation or edition of an ancient human melancholy covered in a kind of hideous yellow wallpaper. We'll see. First, though, a quick refresher on the plot before we go on, just in case you forgot. It's 1991, and Clark is a failed architect running a failing furniture store during the breakdown of his marriage. He's sleeping in the display beds at the shop, he's drinking heavily, and he's seeing a therapist. That therapist, Mary, is our other protagonist. And she has her own issues, like a childhood with a mentally ill mother, and recently watching that very childhood home being demolished. Then Clark finds a weird seam in the wall of his store's basement, and he falls through it into the backrooms, which is an endless fluorescent maze of yellow rooms that seems to copy our world badly. It also copies the people who wander into it as well, or perhaps it just remembers them from above. It's not really clear. Clark tries to prove the backrooms are real, people die for it, and then he crazily decides to stay until Mary notices that he's missing, comes in after him, and finds out what the space and Clark have become. Meanwhile, a research institute called Async has been watching the whole thing on its monitors because they've known about the backrooms for at least a decade. Mary gets out only to land in the interview rooms of Async and an even more uncertain future. And that's it in a nutshell, I think. So a lot to untangle there, but here's the question we're going to tackle today, a deeply philosophical, but also, as we see, I think a political and a cultural and even a historical and psychological question too, which is, are we living in the ruins of the present? And to do that, I want to look at a few things. First, I want to look at the strange story of the photograph itself and why solving its mystery kind of only made it more powerful. Second, why nostalgia is, I think, the wrong way or the wrong word for what these images do to us, because nobody misses these places. Third, the film itself. We'll look at it and everything that Kane Parsons is, I think, telling us by putting his doorway underneath a failing furniture showroom in the 90s. And fourth, we'll look at a philosopher who described all of this years before it even existed, and what he'd tell us about why an empty room can feel so eerily occupied. Then fifth, we'll look at where I think he actually goes wrong and who the ghosts in the back room might be. And then sixth, we'll look at what modern institutions do when they discover this kind of abyss in the film, and then, strangely enough, to the film. And finally, we'll get to the question I care most about, whether there's actually a way out of these endless yellow rooms. And now a quick word from our sponsor FlexiSpot, who have generously made this video possible. But to do that, we first have to venture into the Philobot Backrooms. So here we are in the backrooms of Philobot headquarters, and as you can see, it is a disaster. And that might seem like my fault. There are a lot of books around after all, but here is the main culprit. It's the desk, or should I say table, because yes, this is actually an IKEA table. This is because my old desk was stolen for the Philobot studio, and thanks to FlexiSpot, it's about to be banished. They've sent me an E7 Pro to try out. So first test, how easy is it to put together? Well, so easy, even a philosopher like me can put it together. That's basically foolproof. And as you can now see, it took me no time at all. Okay, so you know I'm a fancy man, but this is fancy. I mean, look at it. And the features are excellent too. There's a 440-pound static load capacity, which I thought was nice until I realized that's over 180 kilograms, which blew my little metric brain when I realized it. And of course, there's an adjustable height from 25 inches to 50.6 inches, or up to 128.5 centimeters. And it's stable and smooth. Just look at this. I'm told that's a dual motor 3-stage semi-C leg structure doing that, which is, well, it's quiet, but it's also really quick and stable too. But for me, it's more of a health thing, right? Because I research, I edit at this desk all day, slaving away to produce content for Mr. Elliot, and this is a bit of a game changer for me. Being able to stand, being able to move, just the tiny quality of life stuff that adds up. But now the ultimate test. How stable is it? Let's find out. How's that, Mr.? Yep, perfect. And even Mr. Elliott's seal of approval to boot. Okay, one problem I have found with this FlexiSpot desk is that Mr. Elliott likes it so much that he won't actually move to let me get on with editing this video. So I guess this is your home now, Mr. Elliott. You can hear him purring. So if you've been searching for a great desk or looking out for an upgrade, I can absolutely recommend checking out FlexiSpot and even the E7 Pro. Plus, use the code on screen below for $30 off, and I've popped a link in the description too. And there's the affordable but still excellent E7 if you're on a budget, and FlexiSpot do site-wide special discounts for students, teachers, grads, medical, and military members too. And thank you again to FlexiSpot for not only sponsoring this video, but also turning this backroom into a nice livable space. But getting back to it, who cares about some random photographs of a decades-old store renovation? And all of this weirdness starts with a thread on 4chan's paranormal board in May 2019, asking people to post images that feel off. So someone posts the yellow room, and then an anonymous reply attaches a caption that changes the whole discussion. It says if you're not careful, and you no-clip out of reality in the wrong areas, you'll end up in the backrooms. 600 million square miles of randomly segmented empty rooms with old moist carpet, mono-yellow wallpaper, and the endless hum of fluorescent lights. Now, if you're not a gamer, then that term no-clip needs a bit of unpacking, because that one word is doing a lot of metaphysical heavy lifting. But if you are a gamer, even playing the original Doom and Quake when they came out like I did, then you know. Because in a video game, the world is held together by what's called collision detection. It's the physics of the generated world. It's the invisible rules that stop your character from just walking straight through a wall. And typing noclip into the console is the cheat that switches those rules off. So you fall through the floor, or you fly out of the level and into the unfinished space behind the game. So saying in the real world that someone or something no-clips out is making a claim about reality, an ontological or a metaphysical claim, that also reality is rendered like a computer game, that the solidity of the world is a setting and possibly an illusion. Older legends needed a curse or a ghost or a doorway to breach this kind of world, but in this myth, it's just a bug. It's a folk metaphysics for people who grew up inside software and PC gaming as avid gamers. And it is a close cousin, I think, to the simulation theory that's beloved by gamers, or the Matrix, or the diet of bad graphics that a lot of us grew up on, all of those sorts of shows and ideas. What's funny about it is that it needs the late 90s and the 2000s to make sense. It's a kind of folk metaphysics that would be actually completely incomprehensible to the characters of the Backrooms lore themselves, which is why they are so horrified and mystified about it. But maybe we're not. Because what happened after that photo and comment is pure unreality. It's pure internet. We're so familiar with it now. Wikis appeared, then numbered levels, hundreds of them, then entities, factions, survival guides, whole taxonomies of this place spawned by one creatively misinterpreted photo. The brilliant writer George Louis Borges imagined in his classic short story, The Library of Babel, that a library like this that was so total that it contained almost every possible book that could ever be written, and that was therefore functionally almost indistinguishable from complete noise. It's the old monkeys with typewriters producing Shakespeare thing, but it's acknowledging that they're also going to produce a lot of Dan Brown shit too. So the Backrooms wiki is kind of a Borges Library of Babel and a junior cousin to it. It's an archive that explains so much, and that it seeks to explain an almost infinite space, so it ends up explaining nothing and expanding endlessly. It's also very typical of the internet, right? Because a civil war broke out between the people building all of that ever-expanding lore and the purists who insisted that the original post was scariest, empty, and unelaborated. Now, I do side with the purists a little here, to be honest, but I'd put the point differently. There is a classic distinction in literary theory. I forget where it came from exactly, but it's articulated in a lot of thinkers, and it's the distinction between a labyrinth and a maze, which many people think are identical, but they do have a key difference. A labyrinth has a centre. In fact, the whole structure exists to bring you to the centre where the Minotaur is going to eat you. But a maze has conceivably lots of dead ends and twists and turns and an exit. You go in one side and the puzzle is getting out the other. You've seen it on children's placemats at fast food restaurants. It used to be scary, but now it's corn mazes at the state fair and stuff like that. But in the Backrooms, for me, it resembles both a labyrinth and a maze, yet it contains neither of the guarantees. There may be no centre. The entrance may stop existing. behind you. There may be no exit. There may not even be a given way forward from room to room and place to place. There's a sense in the labyrinth or the maze that they're playing by some kind of rules, even if you don't quite know them. You're at least given a chance to outwit them. But the back rooms are much more horrifying. They may have none of those things at all. Even calling them a trap gives them too much credit, because a trap implies a designer. And the whole horror of the place is that nobody seems to have designed it for anything. It is, or it seems, completely meaningless. And we'll get back to the philosophical implications of that in a minute. But what happens next amidst this library babble and this expanding wikis and all of this internet mess? Well, 5 years later, here's the punchline. In 2024, a small team of internet sleuths finally traced where that photograph came from.
The real location depicted in the photo is in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Specifically, the Oshkosh Hobby Town store on Oregon Street.
And the really lovely guy who owns it.
We get a lot of calls. For the most part, most of them have been pretty cordial, some of them pretty weird. You know, they'll just call up and even like just ask some weird question, like you say, like, is this the back room or something? And you're like, you know, this is Hobby Town. And they're like, at that point, they don't even know what to say. And but yeah, it's been a little bit of an annoyance for the store, but we've been, you know, we let people come in and come up and take pictures and do the selfie thing, you know.
And the most frightening image on the internet turns out to be a photo of a water-damaged former furniture store that was taken during renovations in 2002, possibly as just documentation for the insurance. And there's one more turn of the screw too. The room probably wasn't yellow. The most famous sickly mono yellow colour is more likely to be a white balance error on an early digital camera. So how about that for nostalgia? And yet the internet built a whole mythology on that mistake and then canonized it. And we get back to the film in the moment, but the film's production designer actually had to build all of these errors into the physical sets, because the error is what everybody remembers. It has become the actual reality of the backrooms. So here's the thing for me. The discovery, this origin story, what the rooms actually were, deflated nothing. Because the horror lived in the room or in the photos themselves. It lived in the missing context and what we immediately projected or saw in them when we encountered them. So you take an ordinary space, you strip away its purpose, its author, its explanation, basically its meaning, and our collective imagination just floods into that vacancy. The backrooms is what happens when the present loses its explanation. And I also admire Kane Parsons, the director of the shorts and the backrooms, because he seems to have understood all of this from the start. His videos on YouTube, and if you haven't seen them, they are well worth watching and they're excellent. They're presented as recovered footage, as like camcorder tapes and corporate training films, as surveillance reels, and they're all built in Blender with real footage mixed in by a teenager and then degraded through a real VCR. He ran it all and re-recorded it through a VCR, which makes it fantastic. All of these videos, they never explain this space. It just gets more and more mysterious the more time he spends with it. These documents document it. And if that structure sounds familiar, then yeah, it's the Navison record from House of Leaves. It's the impossible house known only to us through the film shot inside of it and then recounted through these documents. And the papers written about it, where every attempt to document the labyrinth maze, whatever that was, just makes it a bigger, eerier space. So that's the origin story. But what about the feeling it evoked? What about the almost collective unconscious that grew out of it? Well, I want to be quick about this because we have an actual movie to get to, sorry, but I think it's worth considering before we truly enter the backrooms. And let's give nostalgia, or the nostalgia reading of the film, its due before we start taking it apart, because there is a real longing in this aesthetic for the VHS grain, the camcorder framing, the texture of the home video, even an internet made of anonymous images and the contributions of real people on it instead of personal brands and AI and all of that stuff we have now. And for many people who joyously participated in this phenomenon, in building the backrooms mythos and consuming it, the longing has a strange property. It's for a time that a lot of them never lived in. And there's a fancy Greek word for everything, so there's also a word for this, which is anemoia, which is the yearning for an era you never knew. There's also another highly relevant term for the backrooms too, which is kenopsia, for a particular eeriness, a sort of tingling feeling of a place that should be full of people and isn't. It's the school corridor long after the home bell has rung, for example, or the office on a Sunday when you're stupid enough to be there and everybody else isn't. And this may be a little ad hominem. I don't want to make as much of it as some reviewers patronisingly have, but Kane Parsons was born in 2005, and he set his film in 1991. It's practically a period piece, like Barry Lyndon or Gone with the Wind or Wuthering Heights. It's a period he reconstructed from the archives, from family tapes and from photos, really from other people's memories, which is interesting too, because it's a 1991 assembled second-hand, which may be why it looks the way our collective memories of the 90s look, rather than specifically the way 1991 looked specifically at the time. But that just adds to the creepiness, doesn't it? And in a creepypasta about the manifestation of physical layers, it's adding to the psychological and the historical layers too. But at this point, the nostalgia reading kind of stops working for me, and I'll confess my own generational stake in this. I grew up in the 90s. Oh, you can't tell, and I look fantastic for my age? Why, thank you. That's very kind of you. But I was there, and I can tell you that the technology is one thing. I understand the fetishizing of the tapes and the camcorders and all of that, but the spaces, the yellowed offices, the partition mazes, the anemic corporate interiors, the terrible waiting rooms and rundown malls, no thanks. No thank you. Those were boring, slightly depressing backgrounds to our awkward lives, and nobody who'd stood in them really longs to stand in them again. I mean, things are so much nicer now. But for me, and for most, they aren't the object of the nostalgia. They're part of the horror. Because I really don't want to go back there either. I mean, the frosted tips alone. So we need a sharper distinction, because nostalgia says the world has disappeared and we miss it. Whereas I really think that what the Backrooms is saying is something much stranger, that the world has disappeared and its buildings just haven't noticed. So that's what I mean by the ruins of the present. And to help, think about what a classical ruin is. Rome earned its ruination. It had centuries of grandeur first, and then it had a slow collapse, and then the tumbleweeds or whatever, and the poetry in the 18th century toffs on their grand tours came in, pining away over it. You know, the ruin is the residue of something that was admired. But a dead shopping centre that is 20, maybe 30 years old, and when we walk through one, or when we watch any of those oddly memorizing urbex videos or similar, you know, the one where someone with a camera wanders through an abandoned shopping centre or office or something. And yes, it reads like an ancient site, like a ruin, but it never got those centuries. It just got no-clipped out of the cycle of ruination entirely. It went straight from banal to tomb-like, from food court to archaeology, basically, with no period of grandeur in between. So these are what I would kind of call premature ruins, perhaps. Or even stranger, they're kind of operational ruins as well, because in many of them, as you see from the videos, the lights are on, the escalators still run, the air conditioning still cycles. It's as if something expects business will resume any day now. But what shocks me about a lot of those videos is that the power is basically on in a lot of them and everything still partially works. But it's for no reason at all. The entire structure and purpose of the building has been abandoned. It's also interesting because ruins have traditionally fallen into this fantastical space before. There have been versions of the Backrooms before. It's stuff like Piranesi's imaginary gigantic constructions, or Escher's impossible spaces, or Etienne Louis Bouly, who sketched these mind-blowing and still absolutely impossible cosmic constructions. So we've always been terrified by monumentality, by stone immensity that dwarfs the human figure. And the Backrooms swaps the majestic stone and marble out for the awkwardly familiar materials of a lot of our childhoods and recent pasts. The ugly furniture, the fluorescence. The inhuman is terrifying because it's so far away from us, so monumental. But this stuff, it's banal and recognizable. It's the mass-produced materials that you may even have had and used. It's the opposite. It gets too close to home. And the contrast between the two is what adds a brilliant dissonance and mythology to the film. And here's also where I think the Tony Soprano objection comes back again, because the fear of arriving too late to the party is old. It's older than any of us. But what's new is the form. it takes. Yes, previous generation felt things like we were in decline. It's part and parcel of being old and having dodgy knees. But the cranky old Romans living through and complaining about the fall of Rome, well, they at least were a little bit right about it. And it's also starting to feel like maybe we might be right about it this time too, because the abandoned malls and hotels and shops and everything, they're all undeniably around us. I see empty shop spaces every day at my local shops. There was a financial crisis. There was COVID, which literally emptied out the streets of whole metropolises. As a friend of mine did in London, you could look down something like Piccadilly Circus back then without a person in sight, and it seemed like one of those old photographs from the Blitz, or that another time had come to, well, unlife. And the old internet is still there. It's still a browsable graveyard of janky leaks, like the ruins are still there. Tony could only feel that he came in at the end, but this generation, we can go around and look at it and stand in it. Which brings us to the film and to a furniture showroom with a banner out front reading, "Everything must go." Clark is a failed architect. The buildings he trained to design never got built. His dream sketches are stuck on the walls of his tiny, awful office. It's also quite a yellow office too. It's very backroomsy. What he has instead is a struggling furniture store in 1991, a divorce and a drinking problem, and a liquidation sale. And that banner is the whole film summarised in 3 simple words: everything must go. It's the sic transit gloria mundi of the postmodern age. Just step right up. And Clark's dreams are going. His business is going. His life, he seems to secretly think, is basically gone. And before the movie is over, reality itself will join that fire sale. So let's take a look at Clark's life, particularly his showroom, before anything weird happens. Because Parsons has already built all the horror we could ever need above ground at the start of the film. And a furniture showroom is a strange place when you stop and consider it. It has, of course, stage bedrooms that nobody sleeps in, dining tables that will never host a meal, lounge settings arranged for families that don't exist. It's the original simulation before we even get to the gamer era. In short, it sells images of dwelling. It's the domestic life with all of that living removed. And Clark, whose marriage has collapsed, sleeps in one of those display beds that you're not supposed to sleep in. He lives inside an advertisement for the life he doesn't have anymore. Which, wow. So the store is a miniature Backrooms already. Before the wall opens downstairs or no clips or whatever, in the furniture showroom, at the centre of Clark's life are rooms that repeat, that imply absent people, and that belong to nobody. So when a portal appears in the basement, I've got to ask, how is it really different to the world Clark is already living in upstairs? And I think that also helps solve a criticism that I saw some reviewers levelling at the film, and about how Clark could, at the end of the film, become so comfortable and want to live in the Backrooms later. Well, everyone else always wants to escape, but psychologically and existentially, before the film has even begun, Clark has kind of already made peace with it. He's already made that transition into that space. He's already living there. And it's confronting that uncurable reality that his poor innocent therapist, Mary, eventually has to deal with. That he's not necessarily happy in all of this before or after doesn't really matter, because he's comfortable. And deep down it seems like that's all he really wants. But therapizing Clark aside, there's some hardcore philosophy that's relevant here too. And let's reach for Martin Heidegger, because he's ready at hand to crack this one open. Also, I promise we can take it on without the terminology getting too out of hand. But Heidegger spent a philosophical career describing something so ordinary that we might never notice. That we don't experience buildings as geometry or as walls and elements and all of that sort of stuff that we think about when we build them. Instead, we experience them as invitations. A room becomes a home through what's done in it over and over, until that doing kind of soaks into and layers itself over the physical environment. So a door matters because it connects one meaningful place to another. And in the same way, a corridor matters because it carries you somewhere you have a reason to go, a purpose. The whole thing has, through human use, gained meaning. Heidegger called the whole web of relationships like this dwelling, the way human purposes knit together spaces to form a world. It was his way of getting past one stream of philosophy, the kind of reductive, banal materialism that seems to throw everything that's meaningful out, without getting too woo-woo about it and crazy like Hegel and having to talk about the spirit of the world or whatever. But the reason the word world matters here, and that he wants to reclaim it, is that for Heidegger, a world isn't, a pile of objects. It's the relationships between them and us, between what he calls the ontic and the ontological. Right, okay, but how does that help us with understanding the uncanny nature of the backrooms? Well, every object is preserved there, but every possible relationship that it had with something is deleted. Doors open onto doors, and corridors arrive at more corridors. There are rooms shaped like bedrooms that you just can't sleep in, and there are spaces shaped for waiting in which there's nothing to wait for. The rooms aren't empty of things. Down in the deep levels, particularly, they're full of things, but they are empty of the connections that let those things compose an actual world. So I think that's one of the first, most immediate reasons that we find these spaces so horrifying, and why the place feels wrong even before we meet a distorted monster or a peg-legged pirate. Anthropologists have a very nice concept for these transitional states. You probably know it already or have heard of it, but it's called liminality. Technically, it's actually the threshold phase of a rite of passage. Anthropologically, it's when you've left one status and you haven't yet arrived at the next. You know, stuff as awkward and as horrifying as puberty, for example. But a threshold has two sides, whereas the backrooms is a threshold with both sides amputated. There's separation, and then there's transition, and then there's transition again, and then more transition, and then transition and transition. It creates the growing fear, and it's palpable throughout the film. It's what actually makes the film work as a horror film, really, the growing fear that you might never arrive, never enter a different state, that you are permanently between places, and there are no longer any places to be between. I watched my way through all 23 or so of Parsons' Backrooms YouTube videos, and in my notes I just kept writing, the repetition is the horror. To get all collective psychology about it, it seems pretty self-evident to me that, there's a fear of a generation stuck in here. It's that fear of going nowhere jobs and being stuck in them, and the holding patterns, and worrying that none of any of this leads to anything, that we'll just be doing this forever. It's manifested, all of that, in an endless physical space. But hey, one man's trash, because there's an almost amusing moment when Clark, faced with the abyss under his store, sees the sheer square footage. And that's the joke, isn't it? An architect whose buildings never existed is handed an infinite building, and his response is to want it, to actually like it and be thrilled with it. He films it. He brings in witnesses. He needs to possess and to prove it. People die because of this. And he stays in the back rooms anyway, eating the faces of the creatures that live in there, because it becomes pretty clear once his therapist Mary finds him again that he could easily have just left. He knew the way out at any time. Film over. But he chooses not to. Late in the film, he even says it out loud. He says,
I don't think I want to change.
Then don't.
I like it in here. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm right where I'm supposed to be.
and now you may be saying, but Drew, how does this square with the fears of a generation going nowhere? Clark likes it. And I say, I hear your petty criticism, and I raise you one Soren Kierkegaard, because he put his finger on this a while ago. He called this feeling one of the most dangerous forms of despair. And Kierkegaard thought that the most dangerous form of despair, prepare to get your mind blown, is the one that no longer recognizes itself. The kind that is so deep, like one of those terrifying square backroom shafts, that it has given up. It has settled in. It has forgotten all of that and has started calling itself not despair, but contentment. And for me, what Clark finds down there in the backrooms is, in my view, brilliant and quite funny while still being horrifying. In his store commercials, Clark performs as his own mascot. He's Captain Clark of the Ottoman Empire, the jolly pirate self he wears to sell furniture while his real life comes apart at the seams. And the space, which copies everything badly, copies that too. Not the man himself, but the performance. So in the depths, too, we meet Pirate Clark, the advertisement of Clark grown huge and wrong, and it is what hunts him and finally devours him. And we'll be meeting a philosopher soon who'll get to the late-stage capitalism of all of that in a minute. But it's worth reflecting on that the thing that kills Clark is the version of himself that he manufactured for the market. But who saw all of this coming? Well, it's one of my absolute favourite philosophers who was basically a music blogger in England, and yet he captured the essential feeling that this whole phenomena is made of. It's Mark Fisher, who wrote under the name K-Punk throughout the 2000s on a blog that was read obsessively by a small audience that included basically half the music press. He was a professional philosopher without, for much of his career, a stable academic post, and he had a mind of basically the first rank, while writing about Joy Division and Kubrick and job centres, all often in the same paragraph. Plus, his central subject was quite varied, but it was quite central as well. He kept asking the question, why did the future stop arriving? His most famous answer is in the book Capitalist Realism, and I've quoted it so many times on this channel, quite a lot before, but it's well worth a read if you're interested. I've also quoted its core line before, which he borrowed from Jameson, which is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Fisher argues that capitalist realism is the atmosphere that follows from that idea, the settled, unargued sense that the way things are arranged is the only way things can ever be arranged. No conspiracy required. And its cultural symptom, he argued, is what he called, borrowing again from Franco Berardi, the slow cancellation of the future. It's those decades that stopped producing future decades. It's culture recycling its own past on a loop. It's, you may know it, but retro without end. Constant throwbacks, constant remakes, constant, what has been rather than new stuff. Because the genuinely new stopped feeling possible and kind of stopped being thought or birthed into the world. Fisher noticed that the 21st century sounds a lot like the 20th century remixed, which, now I think about it, sounds a lot like AI too. But anyway, we won't get into all of that. And he asked, hey, what does this say about us? And in his last book, The Weird and the Eerie, he latched onto something really useful for understanding the Backrooms. In it, he distinguishes two flavours of strangeness, and he defines the eerie with a bullseye, but an eeriness. I find it slightly uncanny myself. He calls the eerie, the sensation of the eerie occurs either when there is something present where there should be nothing, or if there is nothing present when there should be something. So it's a failure of absence or a failure of presence. It's an empty landscape with a ruin in it, or a cry on the moor with no bird to make it. And the question the eerie always poses is, he says, the question of agency. It's the question of, is there something here? Did something do this or not? Now, an endless office block with no workers that's always lit and humming where you can never establish whether anything is in there with you, that's eerie. It provokes this question, almost unbidden. And for me, the Backrooms is Fisher's eerie, built at an almost planetary scale, or maybe even cosmic, who knows? But with the question of agency and intention withheld forever. Really sadly, Fisher himself never got to experience it. He died in January 2017, 2 years before our famous photograph got its caption, and 5 years before a lockdown teenager rebuilt those rooms in Blender. But damn, he nailed it. So let's get into that and its philosophical implications. Because I think the film knows this kind of philosophy intuitively too. And Fisher would have very much appreciated its soundtrack. Over the end credits, we get Boards of Canada, the band whose warped, weird, nostalgic, but not analog sound practically founded what's often labelled as hauntological music. And deeper in the film, there's even a Stranger Did cut. The Caretaker is a project by the musician Leyland Kirby, who spent 2 decades looping 1930s ballroom records into ever-worsening decay. And his masterwork is a 6-hour album cycle that simulates dementia, stage by stage, with old melodies and samples surfacing again and again, with more of it missing each time. The sleeve notes to an earlier Caretaker record were actually written by Mark Fisher. And that music plays inside a film that is fundamentally about spaces that misremember themselves. And the rhyme runs even deeper than that, because in Parsons' YouTube series, the deeper you go into the complex, which is what they call the Backrooms, the less the spaces resemble anything. The way Kirby's loops lose fidelity with each pass. So it's a memory as a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. Fisher's own word for all of this, as I briefly mentioned before, was hauntology. And here, with real respect, I want to disagree with him a bit. But first, we have to enact a quick philosophical banishment, because a lot of writing on this film reaches very easily for Jean Baudrillard, the copy without the original, the map that precedes the territory, the Backrooms as the hyperreal. Yes, there's kind of something in it. This is, after all, a mythology founded on a photograph whose famous colour is maybe an error. But Baudrillard was writing about media, about images circulating between people, about a social world that's saturated in signs. In other words, a world that is full of people and communications and things passing between them which might take on a life of their own. But that is not the Backrooms, which actually may make it philosophically eerie too, because the Backrooms has no social world. Its version of media is a television playing static. For what reason, no one knows. So I think that for once we can leave Baudrillard at the masking tape door and keep moving. Instead, let's consider Fisher's concept of hauntology. It's a harder case because it's so nearly right. It's the idea, and Fisher developed it from a coinage of Jacques Derrida's, which for the sake of your sanity and mine, we won't go into now. The idea is that the present is haunted by lost futures, by tomorrows that were promised that never arrived and yet won't leave us. It's the offices and malls and show homes of the late 20th century that were saturated with promises of the career, of abundance, of mobility, the home of your own, of the easy living. And hauntology says that those broken promises linger in the architecture, kind of like ghosts. And on the face of it, that's exactly what the Backrooms is. But I think we need to look closer at the concept of ghost in hauntology and how it just doesn't quite fit. Because a ghost has intentions. A haunting is kind of still a relationship, right? Like the ghost wants something from you, to be seen or remembered or avenged or released or whatever. And at its bleakest, hauntology is still a kind of humanism, because the lost future still cares enough to come back and bother us, to linger around us like a sad little Casper. But in the Backrooms, nothing cares. It's an in-your-face absence of life, even a previous life. It is the expecting something but finding nothing side of the eerie equation that Fisher so sharply articulates. Nothing in those yellow rooms wants anything at all. The figures Mary finds down there, and the film calls them still lives, are just malformed people arranged around a dinner table. And they're probably arranged that way because Clark arranged them that way. In particular, they don't even haunt, Marley and Marley style with chains and warnings. They're inert photocopies of people, and the space that made them doesn't remember them. It misremembers them, the way a machine misremembers, the way a graphics card glitches when rendering, without malice and without anything like love or ghostliness. Clark gives us the film's own theology of the place while he's sitting down to have dinner with those copies.
Who are these people?
This place builds them. Or actually, more like it remembers them. And the more times it remembers something, the less it does. Somewhere out there is a guy in a striped shirt, but in here, he's remembered. Just slightly wrong. Somewhere out there is a man in a wheelchair and a lamp. I'm pretty sure that's how you get all of this. You know, all these places and rooms and buildings misremembering themselves.
So I think I'm trying to actually radicalize Fisher rather than reject him, perhaps. Hauntology describes a present haunted by a cancelled future. But the Backrooms describes something colder, a present that has itself become the residue. It's instant ruins without even a future to project. The promise wasn't dramatically cancelled, it just expired. And everybody let it expire through neglect or lack of attention. Some of the lower levels of the Backrooms even seem like they are made up of discarded, forgotten junk, this residue of now. But that strange world of an aborted future just keeps running, endlessly and forever, which leaves the ghost role weirdly vacant. Until we realise who's wandering the corridors of that strange architecture, unable to leave, unable to rest. If there's a ghost in the Backrooms, then I think it might be us. And this is where I think Kane Parsons' YouTube series actually adds something really interesting to the film, to the experience and to the philosophy as well, because as I mentioned, Parsons' videos are institutional documents mostly. They're recovered tapes, orientation films, autopsy reports. There's quite a funny boardroom presentation in there too, all from a rinky-dink company called Async Research Institute, a company that made MRI machines until in 1989, I think it is, it tore a stable doorway into what it calls the complex. And that's simplifying a bit. Parsons' editions go all the way back to the 1970s and the Second World War, adding in all these layers to the mythology, but that'll serve us for now. And helpfully, the film keeps this continuity. In fact, it's how the movie can end, where it does. And if philosophy is a bit of a backroom itself, then at least I think we are back on territory that I know, Foucaultian territory. Because what does an institution do, even a modest company like Async, when it discovers an infinite, incomprehensible abyss beneath reality? It prepares a pitch deck, of course. In one of the series' best videos, Async pitches the complex to investors as the answer to storage, to office space, to housing. In an earlier video, a researcher estimates that it will save billions in property construction and management. And here's the narrative logic that I find everywhere these days, that cheeky videos like this perfectly articulate. Mystery, military, money. It seems like it's the shape of every modern discovery these days. The unknown arrives, the military inevitably gets involved to see if it's a threat or if it could be used as one, and within a fiscal quarter, someone is calculating how to make money out of it. It really does seem that should a company find an abyss beneath the world, their first instinct is to ask whether it's zoned commercial, and maybe they can store radioactive waste there, or even create a more miserable and terrifying office down there, or house an underclass too. But it's the irony of all of it that elevates this, I think, from satire to philosophy, because the complex is horrifying because it's an endless, purposeless system. And Async's response is to construct another endless, almost purposeless system itself, with protocols, containment, chambers, clearance level, chains of command. The only difference is that the institution can't let go of at least one intention: making money. But the argument should be familiar, even if I haven't put it in Michel Foucault's terms. It's that the investigating institution starts to resemble the object itself, and that the system, even in its breakdowns, always wins, always recoups and recovers and reintegrates the elements that are broken. Plus, J.G. Ballard wrote a really interesting similar story about this in the early 1980s called Report on an Unidentified Space Station, where survey teams are exploring this abandoned space station and filing reports on their estimate of how big it is and its size. And the size grows from 500 meters to almost solar dimensions to infinity, because the more they measure it, the bigger it gets. The joke there seems to be that the measurement does not master the space, the measurement feeds it. Just like the Backrooms wiki itself, or the internet, or human knowledge, as more and more content documenting it just gets shoveled in. Which reminds me, don't forget to like, hype and subscribe and join the Patreon. And that's definitely where we land at the end of the movie, where Mary escapes into the real world and Async, only to leave open whether she's ever allowed to leave that facility at all. Mary survives Pirate Clark, we'll come back to how, and stumbles out of the Backrooms into guys in hazmat suits and a holding room. She's not really rescued either, she's just collected. And in the interrogation that follows, Mark Duplass's Phil delivers the institutional creed, chapter and verse. She asks what's going to happen to her, and he says,
What's going to happen to me, Phil?
That decision's not up to me.
And again, sorry to replay the channel's greatest hits, but this is pure Kafka. It's the man before the door of the law, held there his whole life by a doorkeeper who is only the lowest of many doorkeepers, none of whom can say yes and approve, well, anything moving across the threshold. It's bureaucratic backrooms all the way down. And then Phil says the line that, for my money, is the most frightening in the film. He says,
There are doors opening everywhere. We don't know why or what's connecting them. They just sort of keep happening, and we don't know how to stop them.
And then the film ends. But the mythology and the institutional logic doesn't, as we'll see. Because a mythology that began as authorless and to commercial by its very nature, a story about the corpse of commerce, then becomes a blockbuster. The studios start selling rolls of yellow wallpaper as merchandise. The extended re-release is titled, and I promise this is true, the Everything Must Go edition. For a while, automated copyright claims are even landing on fan artists whose Backrooms work actually predated the film, which was thankfully walked back after an outcry, and to be fair, Parsons defended the artist. But the patent still stands, and Fisher absolutely called it out. It's that capitalism doesn't fight its critiques, it just absorbs them and sells them back to us as content. The Backrooms' journey through our economy is a scale model of Asing's plan for the Backrooms. It's like the satire and the subject have again, sadly, merged. So that was a long trek. I appreciate that. It's almost as exhausting as the never-ending corridors of the Backrooms themselves. But is there any hope in this thing? I think that there is, and I want to make the case at 3 different scales, at the scale of a film, life, and a generation. Firstly, I think Mary's survival, which is a nice kind of break from the final girl trope to me, it matters, and it says something in the film. Because Clark, during his therapy, hostage dinner party, whatever it is, wants one thing from her, to be told that the ruin that he's made of his life wasn't his fault. And Mary refuses. She says, "Nothing's ever your fault, is it?" So she hands him the truth, and hilariously, he dies of flattery instead. He's eaten alive by his own larger-than-life character and advertisement. And when Pirate Clark comes from Mary, what saves her is a chunk of concrete. At the start of the film, we watch her as a child press her hands into that wet cement of the driveway with her mother, and then the house is demolished around that handprint decades later, and we know that she's carried this broken slab of concrete with her ever since. Her past, which has been demolished, reduced to rubble even, and yet she can still wield it. She can still use it. It's clever. It's the past as a tool rather than as a home. And I think we need to notice that the final shot's backhanded gift is part of this too. There's a copy of Mary forming in the misremembered interrogation room, and it's deformed, it's doubled, and it's twisted like a game spawning a character twice in one space. It seems to say that the Backrooms can duplicate the room, but not her. Every failed copy in the film is an accidental proof of the same thing, that whatever a person is, it's unique, and therefore that it matters. But secondly, and this one is tough, I owe the end of Mark Fisher's story, and I'm not going to soften it. Fisher wrote about depression all his life. His insistence was that it should be understood as a public condition with political causes and not a private failure. And in January of 2017, he took his own life, weeks before his book The Weird and the Eerie was published. It was a deep personal tragedy, and it's a profoundly philosophical one too, thinking about all of the work that he could have gone on to create. But here is what he was working on when he died. It was an introduction to an unfinished manuscript called Acid Communism. And it was a turn, deliberate and explicit, and one Fisher, despite his illness, really believed in, towards hope, towards collective joy and consciousness raising, and the recovery of the sense that things can be arranged otherwise, that they can be changed. The communism was deliberately provocative and tongue-in-cheek. Don't get triggered by that. But the great diagnostician of the cancelled future, he spent his final months working, trying to write his way past his own illness. But the manuscript is still here, online, ready to be read, open. It's less a conclusion than a handover to whoever comes next and can move us forward. And capitalist realism has already told us what he believed about closed situations, that the tiniest event can tear a hole in the grey curtain, and that from that situation where nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible. They cannot delay the future forever. And third, there's a paradox that's been hiding right in the centre of this whole story all along. These backroom spaces are supposed to be meaning's absence itself, incomprehensible, inhuman, hostile to imagination. And they have generated an avalanche of human-produced stuff, of creation and of imagination. One photograph of a water-damaged furniture store produced wikis, games, fictions, music, 100,000 renders and theories, and a filmmaker. Kane Parsons, squarely in the generation that supposedly arrived way after everything has ended, who spent lockdown in the emptied world we all did, taught himself Blender in a bedroom and rebuilt that emptiness. And he made something new enough that an entire industry fell over itself to sponsor the art of a teenager. Again, I think of poor old Tony Soprano, who could never see beyond himself, thus his ultimate failing. He admits that, hey, it's good to be in something on the ground floor, right? But he thinks, well, I came too late for that. Parsons came later still, and yet he built a new start right on top of those very ruins. So there is honest hope on offer here. and it's the only kind that Fisher thought was ever worth anything. It's not a promise that things will be fine. That vertigo-induced feeling, Kierkegaard's death of despair, that's real. The ruins really are here. We can stand in them and look around them, and this generation and future generations may have better reasons for fear than any of those before it, with more crises and more warming on the way. But the Backrooms itself, the document of that fear, is evidence against that fear's totality. The rooms are still humming. Nobody turned off the lights, and a generation is already inside, building. But that's it for this episode of Philosophical Film Club. Plus, remember, if you're interested in breathing some life into your own back rooms, then check out FlexiSpot and their excellent furniture. Website in the description. Use the code below for $30 off. Now I think about it, it's probably better, more affordable furniture from FlexiSpot & Co. that probably put Clark out of business in the first place. In any case, until next time, be wise and be kind, and remember...
For every sultan deserves a throne, and we've got one with your name on it.